to give some background to what I'm going to talk about, this is based on research that I've done for documentaries for Radio 4 in Britain. And this is based on visiting sites, interviewing people, and secondary sources such as archives and so on. And the aim of the project has been to look at social and cultural change through changes in the structures, forms, things, places, I don't know what to call them, of the home. So I'll be starting off by talking about rituals and protection, and moving on to psychogeography, and then talking about etiquette and surveillance and social division, which is kind of what the whole talk's about, really. And then looking at fashions and the meaning behind those fashions, and display and the performance of status, wealth, and power. And then looking at leisure, taste, and aesthetics as display. Before moving on to the idea of sociability and incidental communication in spaces such as corridors and the doorstep. And then I'll move on to really moving into comparing ancient practice and modern practice, looking at ideas of physical security and boundary making. And then looking through Mary Douglas's work on purity and danger, the idea of structuring messy experience through boundarying. And finally, thinking about Heidegger's writing about thinking, building, and dwelling, and asking, what is it that we want today in the 21st century, as we kind of carry so many of the traces of former practice into what we do today, maybe sometimes unconsciously. Now, I don't know if you can see this because it's blocking out some of what I want to say here. But the quote at the top is from James I of Scotland, James VI of England, who in the late 16th century wrote a treatise called Demonology. And it just goes to show how the Jacobean cosmology was very much about external forces of evil versus the safety or the sanctuary of the home, and all these ways of kind of protecting people and property. Sorry, excuse me. So, being transformed in the likeness of a little beast or fowl, they they go through, I can't read that, and pierce through whatsoever house or church, though all ordinary passages be closed, by whatsoever open the air may enter in at. So anywhere where there was the tiniest draught, these were especially dangerous places, as were in between places such as the threshold, staircases, and so on. And so there were lots of ritual practices and the making of apotropaic marks to ward off evil forces such as the devil, to stop witches coming in. And if we look at the first picture, that's actually a teardrop shape made by holding a taper or a candle in a very specific way. They were at first thought to be accidental burn marks, but James Wright, who's a building archaeologist, has done really interesting work on this, and has found that they're very, very deliberate marks. And that was the idea of protecting the house by fighting hellfire with holy fire, because candles were frequently taken from the church after ceremonies such as Candlemas. And you might find these, for example, on the fire surrounds, on door frames, and on window frames. And this type of practice has been going on certainly since the medieval period and right up to the 19th century. So if you look at the second picture, you can see I can never remember whether it's a pentagram or a pentangle, but these were meant to confuse witches. They would get caught in this eternal line, going, just ended up going around in circles. And again, you find these on door lintels, on fireplaces and window frames. So there was very much this idea that the domestic interior was somewhere safe, but there were extremely vulnerable entry points, such as, well, the fireplace is really interesting because it's so interior, but it's open to the air. So an awful lot of these apotropaic marks were to be found on the fireplace, and things like shoes and so on, and dead cats, protective objects were buried in the firebacks. And so if we look at the staircase as being an in-between place, these were places that were really vulnerable, because in-between places were seen as being like in-between times, like midnight. That was an especially dangerous time when witches could enter in. And I think that those, I'm not sure what they're the jawbones of, but dead animals, frequently skeletons of dead animals were found. If you look at the shoes, I love why shoes were used, because apparently witches would be attracted by the smell of the owner of the shoes and go in, and then get confused and not be able to get out again. Now, all of these ideas might now seem quite quaint, quite antiquated, but if we look at modern forms, we can see that we still carry with us this idea of sanctuary versus the outside, which can be mundanely described as public and private. But when I move on to the next slide to talk about psychogeography of home, perhaps we can see more clearly how we still have these kind of psychic traces in the forms of our houses, particularly on front doors. They're my current obsession. And we can see this through, if we look at the dragon door knocker. I don't know how many of you have or have seen dragon door knockers, but dragons were seen as being very important because they were they could not only fight evil forces, but they were, again, being mythological creatures, that kind of in-between type mythical beast that could transit between two worlds. And the horseshoe, there are many myths and legends attached to the horseshoe and which way you should turn it. But I certainly have a horseshoe outside my door, and in fact rather too many horseshoes, but this legend is probably one of the principal legends, that the devil needed some new shoes, and the blacksmith recognized him and put the shoes on him when they were absolutely still red hot, and the devil got them off as quickly as possible in great pain, and now whenever he sees a horseshoe he will run a mile, basically. But also blacksmiths are seen as very powerful craftspeople, because they work with fire and iron also is seen as a kind of magical metal. And probably one of the most prevalent things that we'll see on lintels, on door lintels today, is the Jewish mezuzah, which is a scroll citing the words from Deuteronomy in the Old Testament in often very ornate cases, which Jewish people will put on the lintel on the right hand side of their front doors, but also possibly on inner doors, and kiss and touch to give protection. Now, how protective and what they protect against is slightly contested as to whether it is just something you have to do because it says you have to do it in the Bible, in the Old Testament, 3/4 of people interviewed in Israel about them said that they protected against evil. Some people think that they protect against the divine anger of Yahweh, but as you can see, excuse me, I will just mute for a moment. Oh, I can't because I'm sharing my screen. Oh gosh, I hope none of you have this cold. I've just given it to my husband anyway. It is that still these rituals persist, you know, have we ever been modern? I suppose the question is, slightly bowdlerising Latour. Again, I can't quite see what I want to read out, but this quote up at the top is rather terrifying.
Nice.
I muttered, knocking my knuckles through the glass and stretching an arm to the importunate branch, instead of which my fingers closed on the fingers of a little ice-cold hand. The intense horror of nightmare came over me. I tried to draw back my arm, but the hand clung to it, and a most melancholy voice sobbed, "Let me in, let me in." Now, I don't know whether you recognise this. It's from Wuthering Heights, and it's one of the parts of Wuthering Heights that I always remember because it just gets right into me, you know, and it leads me to think about the psychogeography of home, that kind of internalization, kind of merging of dwelling, you know, within ourselves and within the home. It's sort of that is existential fear reading that. And so the home, just thinking about those material protections that we looked at in the last slide, there's also these intangible affective qualities of home that come through to us through, well, everywhere, but I want to focus here on the window, the corridor, and the fireplace. The first picture is from Holman Hunt, The Awakening Conscience. And this actually really upset the Victorians. It looks like a typically Victorian picture, but Victorians liked fallen women to stay fallen in many cases. And here we see the archetype of the fallen woman. She doesn't wear a wedding ring. She's caught in an embrace with a man. The cat, you can't really see very clearly, is playing with her gloves underneath the chair on the left-hand side, like she's being toyed with by the man. And the music on the piano is a melody from her childhood that seems to bring her to her senses. And reflected in the mirror, we can see her looking at the light shining in through the window, and this is seen as the light of redemption. And so here, like a lot of Victorian pictures, they always contain heavy symbolism and a kind of narrative. There's a process going on. So windows can be absolutely terrifying. You know, what's coming in, what's on the outside of this boundary, but also this idea that there's the light of salvation. I'm sorry, this recording's just mainly going to be me blowing my nose. And I don't know how many of you recognise the middle picture. It's from The Shining. If you haven't seen The Shining, don't watch it at night, because I'm not very good at horror films. But here the corridor represents a kind of portal, just as children act as kind of portals to other worlds in films frequently. So the child can see can see the twins. And corridors, again, are these in-between spaces where the inside and the outside, public and private, kind of mix. So in films like, for example, Barton Fink, if you remember the corridor scene from that, with the fires raging and this sort of otherworldly horror starts to enter. Corridors are particularly pertinent in this idea of liminal spaces, not just being between the mundane, public and private, but between us and other worlds. But just to get to a slightly friendlier idea of the psychogeography of home, here's a Christmas mantelpiece. And I know when I did my primary research on mantelpieces, so many people said Christmas. That's what they remind them of. And with that, we get notions of home and family, hearth and home, and so on. And so there's not just that kind of fear which lurks, you know, around boundaries that we've seen in the last two slides, but also these powerfully effective ideas of home and family, which the forms and structures within the house can engender, can conjure up. So I'm moving on here to think about something slightly less scary, thinking about, well, it is scary actually, because it's about social division, etiquette and surveillance. And the first picture is of a calling card. And this was certainly European-wide practice and an American practice. I'm not sure how far it extended into other countries. But the etiquette around visiting, around ideas of the door being both a welcoming place, but also somewhere where you could be stopped, really reached its height here in the late 18th and 19th centuries. And so if we look at the quote at the top, which again I've intelligently managed to block, Catherine, this is taken from Jane Austen from Northanger Abbey. Catherine looked at the number, knocked at the door, and inquired for Miss Tilney. The footman said that Miss Tilney was at home but was not quite certain. Would she be pleased to send up her visiting card or something like that? In a few minutes the servant returned, and with a look that did not quite confirm his words, said he had been mistaken, for that Miss Tilney was walked out. Catherine, with a blush of mortification, left the house. And this just shows that that person, that footman, but also the door act as guards. This was at a time when the practice of visiting at home was becoming more and more popular. And that meant that it could become a way of dividing those that were acceptable from those that were not. And even the visiting cards themselves had this language. For example, you see in this one corner was folded over, and it really depended on which side was folded over as to whether you were coming back, whether you'd be at home later in the afternoon, whether you did not expect to visit again, and so on. And so there, at this time, what's so interesting is that there were these extremely complex rules, but there was no lock on the exterior of the door. There was always someone at home, so different from today, and the chatelaine, the mistress of the house, would hold the key, because in the finest houses there was always a footman there waiting. And it was actually also a time of great danger. There were people called rushers who would knock late at night, and if they could, barge through and and rob the house basically. So this was a time when ideas of security started to take on other physical forms, such as the chain across the door. Um, but but etiquette didn't stop at the front door. If you look at this second picture, which is not a very good example really of a Victorian hallway and staircase, the etiquette was everywhere. Frequently the dining room will be on the first floor, so the maid would let you in. You would look at this gorgeous hallway. Frequently the tiling would be carried on. You'd go up the garden path into the porch, and the tiling decoration will carry on. So the aesthetics of taste were highly important. And you'd be taken up the stairs to the dining room, where you presumably eat things with the right cutlery in the right order. But then when you were coming down, you couldn't just all hustle downstairs. Things had to be done in the right way. So the master of the house would accompany the most important, the highest status married woman, and so on and so forth. And so even in these mass-produced terraced houses, when we have this urban middle class, and probably because we have this urban middle class who really have to kind of distance themselves from the urban poor, you get these incredibly complicated rules of etiquette, basically to separate us and them, which are built into the houses. And if we look even at the spindles, the vertical wooden supports of the banister, even those in a mass-produced house, you could choose from a multitude of choices. What mass production and the Industrial Revolution brought was this access for even the middle classes to materials, to products in which they could express their taste. So all of this would be noticed by your guests visiting the house. And etiquette, what I've talked about really is, these ways of separating ourselves from the others. And you might also do that through your very beautiful dressing of the window. But I'm really talking about forms of surveillance as well. And I don't know how many of you live or lived on streets with lace curtains, which I think are a particularly British thing, having been to other countries, but the twitching lace curtain of the neighbour looking onto the street, just checking that everything was in order and that people were conducting themselves with propriety, is quite a big part of terrace streets in Britain. And so people, even when they're on the outside, are being judged by people on the inside, being expected to conduct themselves properly, keep themselves on the right side of the social boundaries. And this idea of social division is extremely marked and probably reaches its zenith in the 19th century in Britain. If you can see this corridor, this is a servants' corridor. And it's not just a servants' corridor separating servants from masters, but it's also, oh my God, I've just seen the time. I'll rush through. But also men from women, to keep up ideas of propriety. And here we have a quote from Country Living from this month: "The rising popularity of green." I think the rise of green interiors is to do more with people wanting to bring the outside into their homes. And what I'd like to talk about here is fashion and meaning. It's not just fashion, it's not just some arbitrary new trend. Even the humble boot scraper comes about because walking became fashionable in the late 18th century. Walking before being just for poor people, but as pavements started to be paved and roads became cleaner, you still had to have somewhere to wipe your boots from horse dung and the dirt of the street. And so you start to get very ornate door scrapers, boot scrapers. And moving on to the door knocker, here is Wellington's door knocker. The Duke of Wellington, there was a craze for door knockers with his hand holding his staff and the wreath of victory, to show off your patriotism, his success in foreign wars. And so even politics can be seen built onto the front door. And Victorian, beautiful porches. You can think, well, those are very pretty flowers, but also they are they're a kind of industrial nostalgia, a longing for that rural past, again in the aesthetics of the home. And the sunburst, the sunray window of the 1930s expresses that that hope, that kind of modernist, future-looking hope, but also the trend for heliotherapy, not just for sunbathing, but also, for example, for TB patients to be exposed through wide windows that opened up to the air, to the healing benefits of the sun. I am rushing rather now. I had no idea I talked for so long. And this first picture is Hardwick Hall, more windows than wall. And here, Bess of Hardwick, the Countess of Shrewsbury, used windows to express, to show her status, wealth and power to the world. So the visitor approaching will be extremely impressed and overawed by what she had done to this new hall which she built. And then they would come in, they'd huff and puff up the stairs to the great gallery up above. And then they would be impressed once again, looking out over all the land that she owned. And in fact, she bought the glass factory just because she could, really. And if we look at spiral staircases, there is this myth invented a little over 100 years ago that these are for conducting sword fights on to defend your castle. But of course, that's not true, because if an attacker had got that far, then they basically captured the castle. And so spiral staircases were literally about social hierarchy. The higher you got up, the higher your status. And the stairs started off very broadly all the way up to the upper high status chambers, and then would narrow, because then above you would just have the guards of the garrison, just checking that no one was going to attack, though by medieval times that was extremely unlikely. And here we can see the corridor at Castle Howard. The first use of the word corridor was used by the architect Vanbrugh when he was designing Castle Howard. And corridor is from the Spanish runner who would run from the battlefront back to generals and be carrying important messages. And so the third Earl of Carlisle, who had Castle Howard built, wanted to portray this idea, wanted to have imbricated into the very fabric of the building this idea that he was involved with matters of state, and all sorts of important messages had to be carried backwards and forwards. And again, if we look at, I mentioned the tiled Victorian path, this very, very conscious aesthetic for visitors, the homeowner or the inhabitant saying, I know how to perform taste and class. And so moving on to the next screen. I don't know where my screen is. Oh, here we go. So we can take things for granted, like windows, staircases, doors, mantelpieces. But in fact, you can't have window seats in a castle until you have leisure, until they stop being defensive architecture, really. And so even in these very ancient buildings, the window seats speak of people who had time to sit and read, where windows became somewhere to look out over the view, and even the shutters themselves would be very finely painted. So the aesthetic, again, was something more than simply an arrow loop where you would be looking out for attackers. And here we have the tulip stair at the Queen's House in Greenwich. This was built for Queen Henrietta Maria, and this was somewhere where women would they'd go up a back stair and then parade themselves in the gallery above before making this grand entrance down the stairs. And this is an extreme example, sorry, of how staircases can be used for grand entrances and exits. They're not simply to perform the function of getting from one level to another. And even at doors, your footmen weren't just any old bloke that you got off the street. They were preferably tall and young and very good looking. And so there's this performance that, all right, we might no longer have footmen at the door, but the look of our door, how it's answered and so on, is a way of showing off. You know, you might have a Christmas garland, you might have a posh door knocker, or you might have nice plant pots by the door. And I love this mantelpiece because it's not just saying, hey, look, we have a really nice mantelpiece, but also we are readers, and we are readers of particular books. You know, we don't just read trashy novels. So again, using display as a performance of taste and cultural capital. Now, I've been a bit bad with this corridor because it's a workplace corridor. But here's a quote: corridor conversations, God, the place runs on them. We call them corridor conferences. And so how the house is built is incredibly important. You know, you can have open plan, such as particularly in the 1960s. But once you start to get rid of transitional space, you also get rid of a lot of other stuff as well, such as, you know, someone comes into the house and you can whisper to them before they go into the sitting room, don't talk about Boris Johnson with dad, or don't ask Granny about her piles. You know, these incidental spaces are places full of incident, actually. And I mean, my study of corridors was really workplaces, but I think also in the home, once things start to be squashed together and start to make way for other things, such as, for example, status toilets, which are a thing, then you start to lose all these possibilities for different kinds of sociability. And here we see an early picture of women scrubbing the steps, and not just the steps, but also the pavements in front of their houses, which was seen as important for respectability. My granny did this, and women still did it up until the 1960s. But what's so interesting is that this wasn't just labour, that meant that the doorstep and in fact the street became a place not just for competition, who had the cleanest step, but also an important place for socializing. So what we do in these kind of liminal spaces is important, where we can encounter other people. And so once one practice stops, such as scrubbing the doorstep, then other practices start to fade away as well. So moving on to think about what's happening in contemporary society, I just want to compare these two sets of pictures. That here we have the arrow loop, defensive architecture, and we have, in fact, what is thought to be the oldest castle door in Europe, at Chepstow Castle, which is no later than 1190. And these were obviously important to defend from attackers, but also that door was there to impress, to say someone really important lives here, and it wasn't to offer a welcome. And if we compare these with the front door of 10 Downing Street, which is probably the archetype of the door which you can't enter. You notice there's no lock, there's no means of opening the door from the outside. It's a nice boot scraper's mind, which I doubt are ever used. But this is made of steel since the IRA mortar bombing of the early 1990s. And what I noticed in the work that I've done very recently about front doors is, you know, we've moved from those kind of open glass doors with glass windows to the side of houses built in the 1960s, increasingly to doors that are there for security and which say stay out, rather terrifying steel doors, even on quite ordinary houses. And also looking at windows which, you know, moved from being these arrow loops to the window seated windows with a view in medieval times, and increasingly, particularly in the 1930s, you know, to these gorgeous great wide windows where you could look out over your very nice garden and drink your cocktail. Again, to being somewhere which is a vulnerable place. So this isn't ritual protection, this is physical security. And I think this is about modern anxiety, modern fear of the other, and on the balance of risk, rather than have aesthetic windows, we'd rather have these steel secure windows. These are not windows for looking out of. And moving on to what Mary Douglas said in Purity and Danger in 1966, for I believe that ideas about separating, purifying, demarcating and punishing transgressions have as their main function to impose system on an inherently untidy experience. And Mary Douglas wrote about boundary making as being this very important cultural practice, this way of making meaning, really, of the world. And if we think about system, you could think about ritual as being a form of a system, and look at social division as being a form of a system. And it can be easy to kind of forget what's going on with these ordinary household forms until we start to think about what the other could be. So here's a very beautiful, it's from an advertisement, a fireplace. And we might have not necessarily that kind of fireplace. We might have very beautiful kind of displays in the house, bookshelves, windowsills, and so on. And not think too much about it till we look at the alternative, the other. And I've chosen this picture because it really speaks to me of mantelpiece reports, which I looked at in the Mass Observation Archive, which is stored in the Keep in Sussex, in Brighton, where people were asked to describe and draw their mantelpieces or other display spaces. And there were some very beautiful drawings and descriptions of these fine aesthetic spaces in the home. But there was one, it was a man who was unemployed who was living in a very small flat, and all he had was the gas fire. And all that was on the gas fire was a lighter, an ashtray, and an air freshener. And so aesthetics, like the leisure that I was talking about previously, aren't for everyone. People don't have the space, the mental space, to think about things such as making their house beautiful. And looking at social division, again, you know, I'm looking here at the servants' corridor from one of the great houses of Britain, where servants would be kept away from the master and from the family's activities in the house. They're expected to stay very much off stage, whereas in comparison with the on stage, performance of taste and leisure and wealth was being performed. And that might seem a world away from what's going on in contemporary society. But in 2016, in America, the term poor door was coined. I'm sure many of you know about these already, but in developments where there were luxury apartments, these high rises, where the apartment owners or tenants were going through the very fine front door into the atrium and be able to access the gym, the swimming pool, and so on, and go into their very beautiful apartments. Because there often is in developments a requirement to provide social or affordable housing. Um, these tenants were split off from the high status tenants and owners of the majority of the apartments, and pour doors, as they came to be termed, would be around the side, they'd be by the bins, they'd be by the services, and this caused an absolute outcry. They've been justified in various ways, but the very fact that you have this architectural division speaks volumes of social inequality in 21st century Britain and America, because these are also in Britain. I don't know if they're in the rest of the world. That would be interesting to hear. And so, moving on to think about the topic of the conference and what I've talked about, Heidegger wrote, this is from a translation, obviously, building, and I don't know how accurately you can compare it to the original, building and thinking are each in its own way inescapable for dwelling. Something, the two, I can't remember, however, are also insufficient for dwelling so long as each busies itself with its own affairs in separation, instead of listening to the other. They are able to listen if both belong to dwelling, if they remain within their limits and realize that the one, as much as the other, comes from the long workshop of long experience and incessant practice. I love that idea of the long workshop. And that's really what I've been talking about, and the traces that are left behind. The first picture here is from Tatton Old Hall, which is in either Staffordshire or Cheshire, I can't remember, I think it's Staffordshire, which is a medieval great hall which still has the open fire in the centre, which people sit around. And this was a time of communal living where eating, sleeping, business, and so on would all be conducted in the Great Hall. This was a feudal society, and I'm not saying great, feudal societies were great, but this was before social stratification gradually became more and more complex, certainly in British society. So there's that idea of communality and warmth, of mutual protection around this shared fireplace. And here is an example of an executive home on a modern development in Britain, where you can see that there's space for parking for two cars. The doors of the two houses are quite distant from each other, divided by this front garden, which is low maintenance. You're not going to be out there chatting with your neighbours, as for example in 1930s suburban semis with their frame of flower beds and so on. And so this is about separation, about individualization, nuclearization. And so thinking, we might not think so much about door knockers, corridors, and Christmas mantelpieces, but these have been thought into being, just as these houses have been thought into being. This is about the long workshop of domesticity and dwelling. And so, just thinking about the modern global context, this is a question really. Does the way in which buildings have been thought into being now, are they more unsociable? Are they more exclusionary? That we're more about managing risk and insecurity rather than about belonging, They're about the kind of fear of the other rather than this idea of communality, of common rituals and common system. Well, it is a system, but it's a system of exclusion. And wow, I've managed to talk for 50 minutes and not go over. So I'll stop sharing, and I hope people have got something out of that. I can't seem to stop the share. Is someone a co-host who can stop sharing? I've lost my... There.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Okay.
Actually, we did start a couple minutes late, so you're not as over as you may think you are. And thank you so much for putting yourself through this physically, even though that you're ill. It was such a rich talk, and I have thought to myself, but it is now time for the floor for any questions from anyone else here. And again, you can raise your hand, or you can raise it virtually or write it into the chat as you feel. I see Naomi's hand.
I apologize for jumping in, but I always have a question. That was so fascinating, absolutely brilliant. I just wanted to mention something which I think you and I, Rachel, briefly corresponded about. Corridors.
Yes.
I lived in a flat in Paris where there wasn't a corridor to link off, and Mary's nodding because she's had similar experience. Each room led off to the next one. So my room had 4 doors and didn't feel like an enclosed space, but something in between other spaces. And I also just wanted to mention that I may have done as well, but to others, that in French neoclassical drama, all the scenes take place in anterooms. So it's exactly like that picture you had of the 2 men chatting, saying, "Don't talk about grandma's piles," or whatever it was. And then just the other one is, I've just been running a conference and now doing a book on pockets, pouches and secret drawers. And in relation to furniture, I can send you the sort of link to that little bit. There was a thing in Paris, this is 18th century, and I may have missed exactly when you were talking about the visiting card moment, when suddenly people got more interested in security. And there was a thing called the pince voleur, which was a thing to catch a burglar as the burglar was about to try and open the door, so that as they moved their hand towards it, something leapt out and grabbed them by the wrist. Only, according to Carolyn, who gave the paper, she doesn't know if they were ever actually used or caught anybody. Or there'd be something that got in touch with the police, or even a gun actually, on these doors, mostly in Paris. But so sorry, I'm just putting in all these other crazy things.
Yeah, I'd love to know more about the pince voleur rather than having a person there or a chain that something would sort of leap out.
Mechanized version.
Yeah.
Perhaps anyone else would have another question to pose, or a comment, a reaction even to the paper, or even what's just been said. Oh, I see Robert's hand. Yes. But I believe you're muted, Robert. Sorry, if you could unmute. Yes, there we go.
Yeah, no, well, this is strictly for laughs. And I'm sure this is familiar to Rachel. Designed for Living by Flanders and Swan. Yeah. Anyway, if anyone who hasn't actually heard this song, it's worth listening to. I'm sure you can get it on YouTube, but it hits a lot of the points that Rachel has just made. Although, of course, I think it was composed or written probably in the late 1950s and relates particularly to the UK context. But that, of course, was one of Rachel's main points of emphasis. But I really loved your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert.
Mm.
Oh, I see Mary's hand.
The money that one spends to make a place that won't disgrace our house and garden friends. We planned an uninhabited interior decor. Curtains are made of straw. We've wallpapered the floor. We don't know if you like it, but at least we can be sure there's no place like home sweet home.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Robert. I see two hands. I'm not sure if it's Mary or Debbie who went first, but I think it might have been Mary. So Mary, then yes, thank you. Mary, then Deborah Wright, please.
Thanks, Micah. And thank you, Rachel, for a wonderful talk. And I think I echo what Micah said. I think you're very brave to have given it despite how ill you must have been feeling. So thanks so much on the double then for that. And all I just wanted to say was that I think one of the reasons why I found it so amazingly significant and meaningful was because as you were talking, I felt I was understanding much more about the home that my very beloved maiden aunts lived in Dublin, and which I've just recently had to sell when the second one passed during COVID. And so she lived in I suppose it was more a Georgian house, and I'm understanding a lot more about what that house, about what actually happened in that house after listening to you. But I just wanted to make just a general comment. It's not a question at all. It's just really a response and a musing, inspired by your talk. A lot of the sort of architectural features that you were talking about are very, very familiar to me as somebody living in Dublin. But one thing that I notice about the real estate market is that there's a sort of, at the moment, there's in Ireland in general, but particularly I suppose in Dublin, is that there's a split between period homes and modern homes. And there are people who have the means to buy homes are divided into two types, the ones who go for the period homes, the ones who go for the more modern homes. But one thing is absolutely certain, is that period homes means colonial homes. So these would have been homes that were inhabited by the colonial army, if you like. And I mean that metaphorically. And what you found was in rural Ireland, rectories. They were the residences. They were the homes that really spread, if you like, the colonial control over the country. And now, of course, there were the big houses. There were the big houses like Castle Howard, only sort of slightly more modest. There were those, but those were the big houses. Really, at every parish, every tiny little parish had a rectory or a glebe or a manse. And then in the towns, outside the city, there would have been garrison towns with barracks. So whereas in Dublin you would have terrace after terrace after terrace of these homes, in towns you would have had not so many terraces, but you would have had the big barracks, the garrison, the courthouse, the jail, and the barracks. They were, with the barracks being the residence. So just, it's a reflection, but it's just to say outside. Anyway, I stop because it's just, I'm too fascinated by my own reflection inspired by yours.
Thanks, Mary. And I have to ask you a really quick question, because I'm trying to get to the bottom of Dublin coloured doors, the coloured Georgian doors, which are really famous. You can get posters of them. Now, I've read that they were in rebellion against the expectation of painting all doors black in mourning either for Prince Albert or Queen Victoria.
I am not knowledgeable enough,
You're
Rachel,
not
to answer that
knowledgeable.
question. All I
Right.
will say is that those doors, you know, they're, I mean, the Dublin Tourism Board and in general, they make much of those different colours, but they're the fan lights are what really, the little fan lights above them, you know, the one like in Downing Street, and the sort of the lintel, you know, all of that, you know, they're the mark. But the color I hadn't heard of, but you know, to this day, the color that you paint your door in Ireland, I mean, and that goes for all doors, not just the doors of, you know, period homes. It's a huge, it's a big statement. It's the main statement.
Yeah. Thanks. Interesting.
Thank you. I think I'm going to give the last question to Deborah right after which we will end this, I believe, since we will run into the break. So you can ask a question, Debbie, but I'm afraid that will be the last one.
Hello, hi, thank you, Rachel. That was brilliant. I won't say much because I've written loads of bits down because I'm giving my paper this afternoon, and I've written it sort of adds in, but then I think that's adding to what I'm going to say. I was just going to say a few bits and pieces, like because my research is on spaces as well and how they're used, but also like your point of whether this is like a sort of primitive need of a human need or a human thing that we do is, I would agree with that, because I think it is, I mean, it's what I call spatialization, which is we're doing something outside that's actually a way of creating something inside that can't necessarily happen inside. So it happens outside in our environment. I'll be talking about that this afternoon. And I mean, a lot of my work is to do with the way the patients use the space of my consulting room, but it's also the toilet and what they do in the toilet and the corridor and the door and coming in and coming out. So I wasn't going to talk about that this afternoon actually, but I was just going to say, because that's something I think I use Mary Douglas's work a lot, and Judith Flanders as well. So which is probably a lot of the stuff that you're thinking about. And I was also thinking what we'll be talking about this afternoon is spaces during COVID and seeing into people's spaces and how people create their background and what that's about, which also links with what Alison Blunt was saying yesterday. So it was really linked to that as well, which is really good. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you. So I think that links into, I was struck by the word psychogeography at the very beginning of the talk, which I'm not very familiar, but it's always the interior and spatialization of the outside as well. But if you would, I think I will not take any more of anybody's time in the break. So we'll end it here. If I could just ask Ricardo to end the recording. Thank you so much again for this talk, Rachel. Thank you everyone for